Hi, beautiful being, and welcome back to the Supernova podcast. I'm your host, Sasha Nova. Today, we're going to explore the topic of why do we suffer from many different lenses. We're going to look at the nervous system perspective. We're going to look at the energy healing perspective, emotional integration work, higher purpose and gene keys, and then the beauty way, which is the left-hand path of Tantra. So I've been studying all these modalities for many, many years and practicing them in my own healing practice. And today I'm going to summarize why do we suffer? Why do we have suffering as human beings? And my intention is for you to understand this from different lenses, so that then you can find a way to integrate the suffering, to address the suffering from whatever lens works for you in any given moment. So that's my intention. So we're going to start with the nervous system perspective. And from that perspective, we suffer because we have a built-up complex stress within our nervous system, which then results in a decreased capacity to meet life as a conscious adult. So what is complex stress? So another word for complex stress is trauma. It is essentially stress within the nervous system that has accumulated over a long period of time, and most likely in our developmental years, that were not optimal for our development. And so what that does is that it creates these patterns of seeing life, seeing change, seeing different challenges in a way that is not optimal. So for example, for a lot of us, we could be growing up in a family system that does not necessarily cultivate a healthy sense of self-worth. Or it may not even be a family system, it may be the societal system or the culture that we grew up. And so this stress of not having our self-worth validated by our primary caregivers actually becomes complex stress within our nervous system. So that when we later meet life, we may be walking and living our life from this diminished sense of self-worth. So complex stress is something that probably most of us have and have been dealing with just because of how our society is currently functioning, where we are living in these nuclear families. So a lot of the times we are physically disconnected from our tribe. A lot of us don't even have our tribe anymore, which is something that used to be so natural to us. So the way that the society has changed, at least North American society, has definitely contributed to many of us accumulating very complex stress in our bodies, in our psyches, in our nervous system, in our emotional bodies, that then decrease our capacity to receive life, to receive challenges, and to move through them in an empowered state. So that's essentially why we suffer from the nervous system perspective, is because we have this unprocessed material within the nervous system that is there until you process it, and we suffer because we are so full of all this garbage and all this stress, that essentially energy that needs to be properly integrated, properly processed, properly released. And so this actually takes us into the next point of why do we suffer, which is the energy healing perspective. And in this perspective, we suffer because we simply have blockages in our energetic system, which constrains the flow of life force energy. And this actually kind of builds up on a nervous system perspective, because our energetic system it's yet another system, right? Just like our nervous system is a system, our energetic system is also a system. And it is this energetic system that essentially brings energy. It could be called life force energy, prana, chi, depending on what perspective, what philosophy you're looking at this from. But the idea is that we actually have an energetic field that our body emits that represents our whole energetic system. And it is the system that can get kind of like clogged up. So certain energy lines, for example, in traditional Chinese medicine, it's called meridian lines that carry the energy throughout the body. These lines can get blocked up. So this constrains the flow of energy to our bodies, to our organs. And of course, if there's not enough energy in an organ, it will suffer, right? This makes so much sense. And I also have a very strong personal example of this and why I believe in energy healing so much. Because literally when I was a young child, I had a mystery illness that lasted 9 years, and there were many tests that were being done to me. I even had an operation because doctors just could not figure it out, and they're like, let's cut her open and just see, because maybe something's there. And no, nothing was there. Everything was normal, yet I was having these intense belly pains and throwing up. And what ended up healing this mystery illness was 3 energy healing sessions with a local energy healer. Like, how crazy is that? I think that's pretty crazy, and I actually forgot about this until I became an energy healer myself later in life. Yeah, so this is the energy healing perspective, and actually a lot of the times when I work with people, I can sense what part of their body is lacking energy. And what ends up happening in an energy healing session is, we restore the flow of energy into the whole body so that the suffering can then, be decreased or healed. Hope this makes sense. Now we're going to move to the point of view of emotional integration work. I absolutely love this perspective. And from the emotional integration work perspective, we suffer because we resist the so-called negative emotions, and we end up closing our heart. So I also have a personal example of this. So I have a very deep feeling nature as a part of my human makeup. So when I feel emotion, I feel it so deeply that when I was a young adolescent, I decided that I'm not going to feel the negative emotions that, were coming up for me at the time. And what ended up happening is I ended up essentially numb. I couldn't feel anything. And I remember very clearly a moment in my life where I was hanging out with my friends and we're talking about something, and there was something joyful that happened. And, in a normal case scenario, I would feel a lot of joy, but I remember essentially feeling nothing, feeling numb and realizing, oh my God, I can't feel anything. It scared me so much that I actually made a commitment to relearn how to feel again so that I could feel alive. Because what was scary about that state of numbness is that you don't feel like you are alive. And what I also learned from that experience is that we cannot block, the hard emotions that we don't like to feel. and still feel the good ones. We either feel all of it or nothing at all. So from this perspective, we suffer because we consciously or unconsciously choose to not feel, which ends up closing our heart and creates these walls around our heart. And when that happens, the suffering it can be even worse than physical pain, because again, we feel like we're almost dead inside. So that's this perspective. And then next, we're going to move to the point of view of the Gene Keys, which is a beautiful system of self-illumination and self-reflection that I've also been studying for over 5 years. And from the perspective of the Gene Keys, we actually suffer because this provides the exact fuel for our evolution and eventual transcendence. Let me repeat this again. We suffer because this provides fuel for our evolution and eventual transcendence. Like, how crazy is that? So essentially what this says is that we need suffering in order to grow and evolve. It is that our suffering is essentially what moves us in life, moves us to try new things, and then eventually leads to our transcendence, which in the language of the Gene Keys is when you step into this unity consciousness perspective where you're just one with life and there is no more suffering left in you. And what I love, absolutely love about the Gene Keys is that this main premise of every shadow contains a gift, which basically means that every challenge contains a gift, where every time we suffer, there's something in that suffering that polishes us, that makes us into who we are, really, and that brings us to the next version of ourselves. Whether that next version is someone who takes up a new hobby and explores a new aspect of themselves, or begins a business and once again explores a different dimension of what it means to be themselves as a human being. So, once again, from the point of view of Gene Keys, we actually need suffering in order to grow and evolve. Like, what a freaking cool perspective to see it as such. I think it's pretty cool. And next, we're going to move to the point of view of the Beauty Way, which could also be called the left-hand path of Tantra or personhood. That's how my teacher calls it. And from this point of view, we suffer because suffering is familiar. So our personality, which is a two-dimensional way that we are programmed to see ourselves, is not really interested in wholeness and freedom. Because freedom is where the personality dies, figuratively speaking. So from this perspective, we simply become so used to the state of suffering that we find ourselves in that it just becomes like a second nature. We identify with this, with suffering and with the hormones that our body is used to. This actually takes us back to the nervous system perspective and this idea that our nervous system simply wants to survive, and it gets used to the hormones that run through it all the time, almost like hormones in an addiction. If somebody is addicted to something, there are certain hormones that their body produces, and if they don't receive the substance, the body goes into withdrawal. So the same thing happens with our suffering. And we get so used to our, what can be called our emotional house. So the way that we like to see ourselves, the way that our personality plays itself out in the world, whether we see ourselves as a depressive person, a moody person, melancholic, whatever is the label that we put on ourselves and we identify as, is what's familiar. And so from this point of view, we are just used to and kind of almost addicted to suffering because that's all that we know. We don't know any other way to live. So from this point of view, this is what happens and this is why we suffer. So here you go. This is the perspective of why do we suffer from 5 different lenses. And each lens has its own way of addressing the suffering. This is what I specialize in, and depending on what stage of healing someone may be in, to learn more about stages of healing, listen to my episode number 3. Certain tools and certain modalities will be perfect for them. I am a big believer that one man's medicine is another man's poison. And this is why I have integrated all these approaches into the way that I approach healing and empowerment and awakening with my clients. So I hope this was useful to you. And if there is an area of suffering in your life, something that you can't quite get through, reach out. I would be so honored to be your guide and to show you different pathways to freedom that are always available to us as long as we can seek them. And my hope with educating leaders on this topic of suffering is for us to be, first of all, more informed, more open-minded, more open-hearted, and more empowered to know what are the tools that work for us so that we can decrease our own suffering and become more regulated, more happy, more peaceful, and more empowered. So yes, thank you for listening in. Reach out if you have any questions or if you'd like me to expand on any of these points of views. I would be happy to. Blessings. Also, if you enjoyed listening to this episode and it brought value into your life, please share with friends and family whom you love so we can spread the message of healing, empowerment, and awakening with more people. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.